Well, unfortunately, I don't have any answers for you. I don't have any this is a bit of a different talk for me because usually I talk about one of those studies that you mentioned after I've completed the study, but I don't have that today. What I do have is a talk that centers around looking at a recent study that Dr. James Pritchett did on the impact of the 31,000 acres that were lost from production. And I'm going to talk about that in the context of what we might expect to see as we move forward. And then I'm going to also talk about some of the work that Mary Lou mentioned that we were proposing to do. A few months ago, when I was called out to Ray, Colorado, I had never been here. And I was one of the people Corey was talking about that didn't know it existed or didn't know where it was and that sort of stuff. But I walked in the room because they said they were interested in doing some economic analysis. And these are some numbers that hopefully I've got them right, but they come from some stuff that Jim showed us very early on in our meeting. And they showed us that if we look at water use in the Republican River basin, the Colorado portion, about 947,000 acre feet a year. And then what he showed up on the board was recharge of about 550. And difference of about 396,000 acre feet. And just like Justice Hobbs was talking about that professor from the east that comes in, first thing that popped into my mind was just dry up the acreage, right? And that, that professor that would say that. And I especially saw when all the water's going to irrigation, I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here. I mean, isn't the problem we just shut it all down, right? That's the solution. And then you start thinking about it a little bit, right? And these are some stats that I recently pulled together just on unemployment, right? And so this is looking at unemployment rates by county in 2006. And if you look at, this is largely before the economic downturn, and if you look at, there's a lot of light blue, and light blue is low unemployment. The lightest shade is 0 to 2.9%, all the way up to dark blue is 10%. And this is unemployment rates by county in 2006. Anybody guess, does this area have similar or dissimilar unemployment rates prior to the downturn? Relatively similar, right? Doesn't look that much different to me. Then I looked at 2012, and this is the unemployment rates by county in 2012. Right? A lot more dark blue there. Anybody guess if the change was similar or dissimilar? Dissimilar, right? We've heard a lot about, look at the light blue states, the light blue counties on the map. And unemployment is obviously only one indicator of many about the economic conditions in a particular area. But when you start thinking about agriculture in this area and the importance of agriculture in this area, it starts to come out when you look at these indicators and the change over the last 5 to 10 years. The stability within this region is driven an awful lot by agriculture and the economic impacts of agriculture on the region. So when we talk about this Pritchett study, I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to help explain kind of what happened and how it's relevant to what we're facing now. But the other thing is I'm going to shoot a ton of holes in it. And that's not a knock on Dr. Pritchett, because if I was asked to do the study that he was, I'd do it exactly the same way. But when we think about applying those numbers to what we're looking at moving forward, there's a lot of holes that they don't fill and a lot of questions that they don't answer in terms of how should we move forward and what types of policies might we implement, right? A couple of key concepts. One is economic activity. We may hear this number thrown around a lot, but what does it really mean? It means the total number of dollars spent within a region. So in a second here, I'll talk about the economic activity generated within this region per acre of irrigated land. That's just talking about the dollars, the transaction dollars stemming from that acre of irrigated land. It doesn't say anything about profit. It doesn't say anything about costs. A couple years ago, during the drought, economic activity in a lot of rural areas went through the roof. Well, especially in cattle production. Economic activity, the total number of dollars moving through that economy went through the roof. It doesn't say anything about costs moving up and down along with that. It doesn't say anything about profits. It's just a measure of how many dollars are actually being moved through the economy. And it's one indicator, but it's got its limitations, right? And so when we talk about economic impact analysis, where we're looking at what's the impact, the change in economic activity associated with a particular event, we're looking at how did the total number of dollars in purchases and transactions change due to that event. Again, if costs go through the roof and therefore sales numbers go through the roof to keep up with those costs, or at least partially keep up with those costs, economic activity is going to look like it's going up. Right? If I throw a rock through everyone's window in the neighborhood, and we go out and we spend a lot of money to put new windows in their homes, economic activity is going to go up. So it's a bit misleading when we talk about long-term effects. But the numbers I show that we're going to look at in a bit, they're measuring the change in economic activity due to a particular event. Right? So what was Dr. Pritchett tasked with? He was tasked with asking the question, or answering the question, what impact would the loss of 31,000 acres of irrigated agriculture have on the regional economy? And specifically, he looked at I believe it was a 7 and 9 zip code area map, which he focused on. But the lessons extrapolate out to the counties that we're talking about today. Right? So why not just take all that water out of ag? Well, the first thing we see is if we look at the economy in this area, roughly, and we have acres on the vertical axis, and we have different activities on the horizontal axis. But if we look at land area in this area, about 90% of it is actually goes towards some form of agricultural activity, with irrigated cropland accounting for or cropland in general accounting for about 40% of the land acres. So it plays a very important part in terms of the acres. Right? But what about economic activity? Right? So what we have here is a listing of the industry for this area. And again, Dr. Pritchett was focused on the zip codes immediately surrounding that lost irrigated acreage associated with the pipeline. But these percentages don't change much when we expand out to the counties. What do we see here? Well, the first is if we add up agriculture and agriculture-related industries, it's close to 50% of the dollar output in this area is attributable to agriculture. Close to 50%. Right? Irrigated crops account for 16 to 20%, depending on the year and what you're looking at. Right? That's the contribution to the total dollars spent in the area. I want you to notice that cattle ranching and farming, a forward-linked industry, which I'll talk about later, accounts for about 22%. I just want you to keep that in the back of your head, because we're going to talk about who really needs to help participate in making decisions about water use, and it's going to come down to a lot of industries that are a step away or many steps away that are going to be impacted significantly by changes in irrigated production that may or may not show up in some of these economic numbers that we look at. But I just want to keep in the back of your head, cattle ranching and farming, about 22% of total output in the area. But agriculture is what drives this region. Not surprising to anyone here. Right? So how does this work? We have water, right? It's a bit of a lesson. Some of my students are in the room and they can go to sleep like they did in class. You guys can too, but we've got water, and it leads to agricultural production, right? And I'm talking about direct production stemming from irrigated water, and that increases yields, it increases acres and harvested acres, right? And so when we start talking about taking water out of production, we start talking about changing yields and changing acres, right? Earlier we talked about conservation, or we've heard a lot about this word conservation. Well, one form of conservation, one could argue, is just take all the water out of ag, stop production. That's conserving water for the future, even though we learned that it may not have the impacts that we thought. But I'm going to talk about that extreme case where we just dry up the land. What happens, or what can we expect to happen to the local economy and dollars flowing through that economy? Well, the first thing would be is we'd expect to see a change in agricultural production in those industries that use water. And Dr. Pritchett, in his analysis, looked at 31,000 acres being lost. You look at the general makeup of irrigated acreage in the area, and he applies that and looks at the change in economic output, the change in dollars moving through the economy due to those lost acreage. And he estimated about $22 million in lost activity, right? And that was for that acreage. And that was a few years ago. The numbers probably haven't changed. What's important for us to think about moving forward is that if we dry up that land, the ballpark number would be in lost economic activity about $712 per acre, right? That's not profit. That's lost economic activity in the region. So one thing I was looking at also when I was trying to learn a little bit more about the area. So this is farm income in 2012, and the key at the bottom there is a little hard to read. I guess what's important here is that you notice in this area right here we see a lot of dark green, and that's a lot of farm income. And if you look at it as a percent of total income, this area stands out from the rest of the state as well, not surprisingly. Why is that important? Because when we look at the impact of taking that water off of the land, right, that means less income. Right? That first round of numbers we just looked at only captures that direct effect. We also have what we call backward linkages, and part of that would be a decrease in the amount of labor employed. Right? And that impacts because that trickles back through the economy, because why? They spend less of that money locally. There's a change in the amount of inputs purchased in order to do that production. And that trickles back through the local economy as well. Right? So for those of you that are in the room that aren't directly impacted by a change in irrigation, it starts to impact you because it works backward through the economy, both at this first stage of less inputs being purchased, less employment being generated because of that lost agricultural income, but those industries spend less in the local economy. Those employees who no longer have that farm income spend less in the local economy, and it stops activity well beyond the area. So Dr. Pritchett, looking at this, looked at, well, what is that impact? If we start with about $22 million in direct economic activity lost because of that acreage, when we add on the impact backwards on wholesale trade, ag, forestry, note it goes all the way down, well beyond just what we might think of as directly related agricultural markets, and it increases it to about 25,692,000, or approximately $824 per acre for that. And I want you to notice something, right? Wholesale trade, those industries that were at the top of that list before, those are the ones which experience significant reductions due to that lost backward linkages because of the reduction in irrigated ag. But a little surprising when I looked at this was cattle ranching and farming actually is pretty far down on the list considering its integration with the local economy. Right? We might be tempted to say, well, we wouldn't see them impacted that much. But this is where we get into this type of analysis, which is referred to often as in-plan, being insufficient to characterize what might happen. Right? So it's not just these backward linkages that we have to worry about in an economy, right? Which is what we captured by doing this in-plan or this input-output analysis, which shows us that for every dollar that we lose from direct production, there's also an extra about 20 cents in lost economic activity looking backwards due to that lost economic activity in the irrigated ag sector. But in addition to that, there's also forward linkages. There's changes in the dollar amount of output sold to consumers or exported, and that's where money flows into the region, and that's what we lose. This particular model can't help us with that, and we don't really know moving forward about what the magnitude of that may be. There's also, there's also a change in the amount of output sold to what we call forward-linked industries. And that's where we start talking about cattle and ranching. When we looked at the economic impacts of the drought in 2012, statewide, due to the reduction in irrigated production, we were looking at the impacts on cost to cattle and ranching industries of about 15% just due to that single-year event. Right? So these are somewhat considerable impacts moving forward that we don't have any idea of at this point in time. Right? Important notes about what I just presented. First of all, this does not reflect, as I said, the impact on forward-linked industries. We don't know. I can't tell you moving forward what a reduction in pumping is going to have, what impact that would have on those forward-linked industries. It's also just a snapshot. That's a one-year estimate of what would happen. That's not moving forward. And when we talk about the groundwater pumping, it's really a dynamic process that I and any other economist in the state of Colorado is not going to be able to give you a good estimate moving forward to help you make those decisions. Right? There's no hydrology connected. Right? We know that changes in production patterns is through Jim's model are going to have an impact on the hydrologic conditions that you guys face to some extent. We have no way of saying that right now, what impact that would have. Right? What we do know in looking at a few studies in other areas. And this was a study by a colleague of mine, Nick Brozovic, who's at the University of Illinois. But he modeled groundwater, surface water interaction and added the economic impact, so kind of overlaid on some of the work that you've already been doing. And he was looking at advantages of different types of policies that could be implemented. Right? And the current policy, which is essentially an across-the-board reduction, he estimated the impact of the cost of reduction associated with that at about $6.42 per acre. Right? So why am I showing you this? I can't tell you as of this point what impact different policies would have, but I can tell you, looking at their analysis, the alternative policy that they ended up focusing on reduced those costs per acre of the reductions in groundwater pumping to $1.59. Right? The worst thing that you can do is just completely go with shutting off the wells. The significant impacts of that are evident in Dr. Pritch's work. You stop production, and it has these backwards linkages that ripple through the economy, especially a rural economy like this, which is heavily reliant. There's alternatives out there that you can use, and they can have significant impacts on how bad the medicine is that you end up having to take. Another example of this is from my home area, Kern County, California, and they looked at some alternative means of managing some of these resources. And the alternative that they ended up going with resulted in, relative to the baseline scenario, a 27% increase in profits over the time horizon. It does matter what choice you make today. It's not just make a choice today, but it matters which one you do. So now I'm standing here telling you it matters what you do. It's really important for the local economy. And I've also told you that I have no information to help you. Right? I am that professor from the East, aren't I? Right? So I just found out about this a few months ago. We came to these meetings, and so what am I doing to help? Well, we're seeking funding to help us. That Nick Brozovic study was $1 million over 5 years. We don't have $1 million. We don't have 5 years. Right? I'm not looking for $1 million. But what I am trying to do is seek funding, both at the state level, and we're going to hopefully submit a federal fund grant here pretty soon to help us get some funds to help give you the answers that you need. And that's going to revolve around doing some modeling, because that's what we do as economists. Right? We're going to start with looking at a shared aquifer, and we're going to have multiple users, different irrigators, and this is going to overlay, essentially, a lot of the work that's already been done. And we're going to look at how those other inputs combine with water to produce output, and how that impacts land use and recharge and agricultural output. And then we'll overlay that on top of that regional economic that I've already talked about. So we'll look at baseline, what happens over the next 50 to 90 years to the amount of water that's pumped, what's produced on land, what impact that has on other inputs, and what impact that has on ag output. Just looking at applying this economic model over the top of what's already been done. So then we're going to look at what happens if we have a decrease in pumped water. Right? I'm not going to tell you how to achieve that. That's not my job. That's something that you're going to have to decide. But what we're going to hopefully come up with is answers for you in terms of what if we decrease the amount of pumped water by this percent or that percent over the next 50 to 100 years. Okay? And with that, we're going to be able to answer questions about the impact that it's going to have on other inputs and other industries that provide those inputs in the area. We're going to be able to get you answers on what impact that's going to have on land value and land productivity in the area. And we're going to be able to get you answers on the impact on economic output from the agricultural sector in the area. And then again, overlaying that input-output model, we'll be able to hopefully tell you how the changes in economic activity, changes in output from this area, impact the larger economy. Right? Some potential good news. Right? I had to talk about one of the studies that I've already done, so I'd like to do that. So I've always thought, you know, I hear all the time, I give a lot of talks, I hear all the time, we got to save ag, we got to save ag. Right? And I hear it a lot in that junior college when I go speak down there in Boulder. There's surprisingly a lot of people that want to save ag, right? And I walk out of there thinking, I can't believe that's true, right? When the actual price tag comes, I can't believe that that's true, Right? So I'd always wanted to do a survey where I asked people, and one way I could do it is I could take some of the information that the state has put together on the alternatives that we have moving forward across the state, and I could put together some options for them. And I could say these are 3 different portfolios. Right? We have a gap if we ignore, which ranges from 500 to 800,000 acre feet, depending on which numbers you want to look at, and which projects you're counting and that sort of stuff. But we have a different options for policies that we could help achieve that gap. And you notice at the bottom, and this is across all the literature, ag is where the remainder of the gap is met. Right? That's just what all the studies, how they talk about it. It's whatever's left over after supply projects, non-price conservation, pricing policies, whatever we don't meet with that is going to come out of ag. So I thought I'll ask these people, statewide actually, do they want to save ag, right? See what they say. But I thought, you know what, I'm going to ask them a separate survey, and I'm going to put in front of them the impacts, because the state has also done some great work on what impacts municipal conservation might have in the landscape, what it might have on the prices of water that cities pay. And I thought if I put in front of Boulder what their parks are going to look like if we conserve, what their water bills are going to look like if we conserve, they're going to say, ag who, right? This is what I was thinking. So we put in front of them in a completely separate survey that went to other people, random set of people, we put together the different impacts associated with those different portfolio options, right? And we asked them to choose. These 2 surveys both said, what's most concerning to you? What do you prefer? What's least concerning? That sort of stuff. And these are preliminary results because we just did this not too long ago. And this is the potential good news. Right? When we present them with these impacts, I should go back actually. This is a picture I took when I was a grad student of land that had water transferred off of it permanently. It's a little hard to see. Right? That's actually revegetated land down in the Arkansas Valley, right? People on the Eastern Plains, what did they cite as the most concerning impacts? Potential good news, and actually not that surprising when we put these impacts in front of them, was about 52% of them were concerned with ag transfers and removing production and having those impacts on ag land that I just showed you, right? Much farther down the list was public landscaping, private landscaping, and actually impacting ag transfers was more concerning across the board than any of these others, which included an increase in the price of your bill, an increase in the fixed charge on your bill, and all of these other things that would result if we chose not to go after ag. Plains. The reason I wanted to do it is because I thought those people in Boulder would all of a sudden start choosing their landscaping and their price. Not surprising, the Front Range and the way we define that was the major population areas still showed that same concern for agriculture. And that concern isn't tied to the lost production or the lost output. That's concern for agriculture as a public good. So what's the good news here? One, you're going to need support to get funding to help do this. You're going to need support from outside the area. You're going to need support from outside of just those irrigated producers in the immediate area. There is widespread support to help come up with solutions, to help find solutions. You just got to tap into that somehow. You've got to work together is the theme of the day on how to come up with solutions that best meet your needs. What's that portfolio of policies that best meet your needs moving forward? So with that said, any questions we're going to hold to the end, but thank you.